This is the Fantex P500A, and it's one of the highest airflow mid-tower cases that you can buy right now. But as someone who primarily prefers more compact, denser ITX systems, how much am I really compromising on thermals with those builds compared to something like this? Much more volume and supposedly a lot more airflow. For example, how much cooler will a high-end graphics card run in the P500A, and how much better is component compatibility? So that's exactly what we're going to be taking a look at in this video, and I think this is going to be very useful for those who might be on either end of the form factor and might be considering switching. Now, some of you already know this, but the reason that I stopped reviewing mid-tower cases a while back is because, one, they're already pretty well covered by my friends over at Hardware Canucks and Gamers Nexus, and two, most of them are pretty much the same thing. With ITX, on the other hand, there are so many different layouts, design approaches, and compatibility compromises to discuss, and they're always ever-changing depending on hardware dimensions and cooling demands. But that doesn't mean that I don't like mid-tower ATX cases like the P500A. I just find them a little bit boring and repetitive. But I think that whole lack of innovation and repetitiveness in design actually says that, you know what, mid-tower cases probably can't get much better than what they're at right now. And I think that's pretty well demonstrated here with the Fantex P500A. Coming in at 62 liters in volume, it's about 6 times larger than the typical ITX cases that I build with, but that of course comes with the usual treats of working in a mid-tower. For example, the support for multiple 3.5-inch and 2.5-inch drives, huge radiator support, air cooler clearance for something like a Noctua NHD15, and support for multiple GPUs. The P500A actually uses the frame of the Evolve X, which I like quite a lot. That means sliding covers on the interior and familiar cutouts in the motherboard tray and power supply shroud. But before we dive into the temperature charts, probably one of the most popular reasons to go with a mid-tower case over an ITX case is that you actually get to display your system. As much as the space optimization and hardware layout of an NCASE-M1 or Form T1 is enough to get someone like me super excited, a lot of people just can't get past the fact that their expensive, prized components will be boxed up and out of sight. So the way that I test ITX cases against each other when it comes to thermal performance is by using the exact same test system across all cases. That means the same GPU, CPU, motherboard, and identical motherboard settings. The only two things that change between these cases are the CPU cooler and the fans, which for each case we test the most effective cooling solution possible to accurately represent the potential for each case. So for example, for the Fantex Evolve Shift 2, that would be a 120mm AIO, but for the NR200, that would be a 280mm AIO. For the Fantex P500A, the biggest cooler that we can fit in here would be a 420mm AIO, which I unfortunately don't have on hand, so we're going to use the next best thing in line, which is a 360mm, and we're going to be mounting that at the front. I've also positioned the 3 pre-installed 140mm fans towards the rear as exhaust, and this way we're populating every fan position possible in this case. So how does the P500A do against some of the best ITX cases on the market? Well, our first contender is the NZXT H1, a super easy to build in vertical 13.5 liter case with a pre-installed 140mm AIO. With our 10900K overclocked to 5 GHz, the NZXT H1 is basically just enough to run things safely. The P500A on the other hand runs around 17 degrees cooler and can do so with much lower noise levels. As for GPU thermals, the difference is just as massive. The P500A can run our 2070 Super around 15 degrees cooler at about the same noise level. That's really impressive. Next up though, the 9.5 liter Form T1. Smaller than the NZXT H1, but can support more cooling and has better ventilation. I've tested the T1 here with the new Fantex 240 MPH cooler with a pair of slim Noctua fans. We do improve marginally on our 10900K thermals here over the H1, but it's not by a whole lot. GPU thermals on the other hand are now 12 degrees better than the H1, but still a big margin off the P500A. But now let's add in a few more cases. Next up, some popular ITX contenders which all have a very similar layout: Cooler Master's NR200, the NCASE-M1, and the Streetcom DA2. In terms of CPU thermals, Cooler Master's NR200 does the best here out of the 3 thanks to supporting 6 fans in total. That's the same number of fans that we have in the P500 P500A. With a 280ml liquid cooler, it's within about 7 degrees of the high airflow mid-tower, with the NCase M1 being about 13 degrees warmer at a similar noise level. Then for the GPU, things get really interesting. Our NR200 actually ties both the cooling performance and noise levels of the P500A. Since the NR200 can support two 120mm intake fans directly below the graphics card and another two directly at the top of the case for exhaust, we have a really effective airflow setup here. However, this result might change in favor of the P500A if we were to use a thicker graphics card and then couldn't fit those two 120mm fans at the bottom of the graphics card in the NR200. So just keep that in mind. Now let's add in a couple of the larger ITX cases of the stack, the Silverstone SG14 and the Phanteks Evolve Shift 2. There's not a whole lot to say here in regards to CPU thermals, both cases are a fair bit off, but for GPU thermals, the Phanteks Shift 2 mesh is pretty damn close. It manages to tie the P500A at 72 degrees C, although at a noticeably higher noise level. Lastly, the main event, the Supt Meshlicious. An awful name for a PC case, let's be honest, but with a full mesh exterior, it's basically unrestricted when it comes to airflow. For CPU thermals, we get our closest result yet. The P500A is still slightly better overall, but for each comparison that can be made here, the Meshlicious is a bit quieter to be fair. Overall, I'd say this is a pretty outstanding result considering it's just a 14-liter case. For GPU thermals though, the Mesh ITX enclosure runs about the middle of the stack, 76 degrees C here with the fans as intake and 74 as exhaust. Overall, that's about 6 degrees warmer than what we can achieve with the P500A. But I was also really interested to see how the high airflow mid-tower would handle the new flow-through cooler design on the new NVIDIA Founders Edition cards versus some of the ITX cases that I've tested with this previously. As we can see, the P500A supports this airflow path quite naturally, taking air in from the front and exhausting it both upwards and outwards, whereas ITX cases either work against this airflow path or encourage it. The results do favor the mid-tower at the top of the stack, giving us the thermal performance about equal to an open test bench, but it does need a lot of airflow to achieve that result. Surprisingly, the NCase M1 actually isn't far off here at all. Just 2 degrees warmer for a case that's 1/5 of the size. That's a really impressive result. Furthermore, the under 10 liter T1 is totally viable with this GPU if you offset the power supply from the flow-through fan like we've done here, but other sandwich layout cases where this is not possible, like the Ghost S1, they do suffer dramatically with this cooler. So overall, yes, we can pretty much match the thermal and noise performance of the highest airflow mid-tower cases available today, but there's no single ITX case that can match both the CPU and GPU performance of the P500A. For our CPU results with the 10900K, the soon-to-be released Supt Meshlicious is pretty much there, but for GPU thermals, the mid-tower isn't noticeably cooler, and there it's matched by the NR200. So keeping that in mind, there is definitely a thermal compromise by downsizing to an ITX case. Generally, we can get close to CPU or GPU thermal performance depending on which case you choose, but there is no single ITX case yet at least that can take down the thermal performance of a high airflow mid-tower. Personally, I would much rather take an NR200 or an NCase M1 and take a few degrees warmer GPU than have a much bigger case on my desk. I do prefer a more compact form factor, but I understand not everyone feels that way, and that's why tests like this are very useful for both perspectives, because that way you can kind of make your decision for either one. I'd love to know your thoughts on this down below. As always, a huge thanks for watching, and I will see you all in the next one.